Welcome to the first follow-up video. Each week I'm going to do a follow-up video. After I've gone through the discussion boards and participated with all of you on the discussion boards and given the grades, I'm going to sit back and think, okay, what were some of the common misconceptions that people had, or what are some issues that I really want to follow up on? Right? And so immediately after I've done the grading, I'll prepare a video and I'll post that on Blackboard. Usually that'll come out around Tuesday of the week after. So let's go over several items related to the issue of preferential hiring. First of all, I want to say something about what constitutes preferential hiring, specifically what distinguishes preferential hiring from affirmative action. Affirmative action is a broad category. It refers to any attempt to increase the representation of members of particular groups within an institution. So if it was something, say it was a university giving out scholarships, okay? Affirmative, instead of doing some kind of preferential hiring, the university might engage in outreach programs. They might do advertisements. They might go into the schools. They might do all kinds of things without giving any preferences to members of the group whose representation they want to increase. Okay? So if they decide they want more Vietnamese American students, they might do all kinds of things other than giving a preference to Vietnamese American students in the application process. Now, preferential hiring is a much more specific category. A company engages in or other institution engages in preferential hiring when they say, in some cases, we are going to hire someone that we would not otherwise have hired. So we'll hire one candidate when we would have hired another because the candidate that we choose is a member of a particular racial or ethnic group. Of course, I'm specifically focusing on cases where that's done as a form of affirmative action. That is, as a way of increasing the representation of members of that group within the institution. Right. So preferential hiring is a narrower category within affirmative action. Having said that, right, I also want to emphasize that preferential hiring does not necessarily mean hiring underqualified candidates. Why is that the case? It's the case because there are many cases in which an institution realizes that they have a large number of fully qualified candidates. So they might say, okay, we've got many fully qualified candidates. Right? We could go with the person who, according to our standard measurements, would be the most overqualified or goes the most beyond the qualifications. But instead, we're going to pick someone who goes just a little bit beyond the qualifications or just meets the qualifications because that person belongs to a particular group and we want to increase the representation of that group within our employees. Okay. So again, preferential hiring does not necessarily mean hiring an underqualified person. Now that I've said that about what affirmative action is, my third point has to do with the argument that I gave in favor of preferential hiring, right? Or in favor of sometimes using preferential hiring. I didn't give a general defense of preferential hiring. I gave a very specific, detailed argument for preferential hiring. First of all, I focused the issue. Okay. I said, okay, there's many cases in which there's a reason why. Okay. There's many cases where there's a reason why the company thinks they get a personal advantage or an institutional advantage by hiring members of that group. Right? For example, they might hire a Vietnamese American candidate in order to do certain forms of outreach in the Vietnamese community. And I said, let's set those aside for a moment. Right? Let's look just at those cases in which the company says, you know what, it's indifferent to us in terms of accomplishing our normal goals. But we think it would be good for society to engage in some preferential hiring. And I tried to give an argument why even that could be justified, which most people think is a little harder to justify. So, what was that argument? Well, the argument was centered on the idea that preferential hiring can promote the common good. How so? Here's how I said that it could promote the common good. That is, the good of everyone. in society, we tend to have pockets of underprivileged people. In particular, there are certain ethnic groups that tend to be underprivileged, right? Specifically, certain groups that have less access to jobs, to first of all, getting jobs, and second, to career advancement, and therefore have a more difficult time getting access to good education and to economic self-advancement. Moreover, right, people tend to get jobs, especially find out about available jobs through networks, right, through their social networks. And therefore, right, a person who is, say, African American, particularly from a low-income African American family, is going to tend to know other low-income African American people and therefore not have as much access to career opportunities as, say, a white person from a wealthy suburb. Now you'll notice I didn't just say it could be good for the members of those groups, of those underprivileged groups. I argued that preferential hiring could be good for everyone in society. Why is that the case? Well, it's kind of a version of the claim a rising tide raises all boats, right? Some people say, well, if the economy as a whole gets better, then things will get better for everyone. That's not always true, right? But we could say this. I think we could say this. If we could arrange things, if we could make improvements so there were fewer pockets of people that were massively underprivileged economically, everyone would be better off. We'd be making better use of everyone's resources. People in those groups would have more money to spend, etc. Right? So I think there would be all kinds of economic and other advantages to society if we could make improvements, we could make progress so that we no longer had pockets of underprivilege, particularly ethnically based pockets of underprivilege. So my claim, now you might say, well, is it really an advantage for the person who gets passed over for the job? My answer is, well, no, not if they're going to pass away in the next year. Right? But if they're going to live another 20, 30 years, it's quite likely that they will experience indirect benefits. More to the point, it's likely that any children or grandchildren will experience economic benefits down the road. Right? So, in the center of my argument was the idea that this is for the long-term common good. So preferential hiring doesn't just help the people who get the jobs, or even members of their social networks, but indirectly helps everyone. Right? And that's a quite common thing in life. We directly help some people because we think that directly helping some people will indirectly help everyone. Now this brings me to my fourth point. Notice that my argument is not primarily about fairness. Right? That is, my argument does not in itself say anything about being fair to members of certain underprivileged groups. So it was not an argument based in compensation for past discrimination. Now you can make those arguments. I didn't happen to give one of those arguments. Right? You could also make this as a supplement to my argument. You can say, okay, well, given this general argument, right, since we might have to pick and choose between underprivileged groups, fairness gives us a reason to choose or compensation for past racism gives us a reason to concentrate our resources on inner city African American communities rather than predominantly white Pennsylvania mining towns. Right? But the argument itself was not primarily based on considerations of fairness. Now this brings me to my next issue. Okay? So my fifth issue has to do with the question of discrimination. So some people have said, well, this is if you favor members of ethnic minorities, particularly over white candidates for jobs, you're engaging in discrimination. And other people said you were not. Well, here's my answer to that question. Yes, you're engaging in discrimination. Right? If by discrimination we mean distinguishing between two people and giving an advantage to one based on their membership in a category, yes, this is a case of discrimination. And some people have said all discrimination is wrong. At which I step back and say, whoa, I went to see my sister in Crestwood, Missouri over Christmas, and I didn't give out Christmas presents to every child in Crestwood or even in her neighborhood. I gave Christmas presents to my nieces and nephews. So there's a sense in which I discriminated against all these other kids. Why? Well, I discriminated against them for not being my nieces and nephews. Right? Or more generally, it's normal for us to, in a sense, discriminate in favor of our family members against other people. Right? Now, there are limits to this, okay? I couldn't just let my neighbors starve because they're not my family members. Okay? But there's a sense in which favoring people because they meet certain characteristics, right? Even something that seems arbitrary, like being born into a family, right, seems perfectly legitimate. And for what it's worth, my nieces and nephews were not born into my family, right? We kind of made a choice. I mean, we definitely wanted them as part of our family, right? Oh, it was my sister's and brother-in-law's decision, not mine, right? But it was just sort of who came up that the court suggested that they take into their home, and they did, right? And they loved the 4 kids, and so they adopted it. Right? There's an element of arbitrariness in this. Right? But that doesn't mean because of that element of arbitrariness that I can't favor my nieces and nephews over other children. Right? So what I want to say here is, yes, it's discrimination in a sense. Right? But discrimination is, in that sense, is sometimes appropriate. Sometimes we make distinctions, right, between groups of people for various reasons. And as I argued, there's a strong American tradition in particular of members of ethnic groups banding together. And of course, I would argue it makes a difference when you're discriminating in favor of a group you have an affinity with, as opposed to discrimination against a group because of you want to marginalize them. Okay? Giving a little help to members of a group you happen to like is very different from taking actions designed to hold back members of groups that you hate. Now, the final thing I want to say is not actually about the issues itself, but it's more about the approach in the course. I want to point out that there are times, like this one, where I give very specific arguments. And more to the point, there are times when I ask very specific questions. And people naturally want to push things to be more general. Okay? So I give a very specific argument in favor of affirmative action, right? And then I went online and I gave what I thought were the 5 key points where people might criticize that argument. Right? People wanted to push it to be more general. Right? For example, sometimes people said, well, this is really interesting, but let's not just talk about the appropriateness of voluntary acts of preferential hiring. Let's talk about whether or not we should force people to do so. Right? Well, I think that's important and it's legitimate, right? But that brings in 20 other issues. Right? So when I looked at what I want to talk about, I thought, I could talk about the EEOC and the question of whether we can mandate that companies do that. Right? But that brings in 20 other issues along with the question of whether or not preferential hiring is morally acceptable in the first place. Right? Moreover, right, if it turns out that preferential hiring is morally wrong in itself, whether you're forced to or not, well, that's going to make a huge impact on the political issue. And finally, there are lots of people out there who say that preferential hiring is wrong even when it's voluntary. Right? So I said, okay, we have this question that involves 20 different issues. Right? I'm going to pick one of those issues and talk about it very specifically in detail. And then not only that, I'm going to give one argument for it, right? And I'm going to present what I take to be the main objections to that argument. Right? And I ask you to discuss that. Right? Now, in office hours, right, or maybe in some separate forum, I'd love to talk about the general issue. That's great. But when I ask you to talk about something very specific, right, make sure that you talk about the specific thing I ask for. Now, why do I say this? Well, there's a reason for that. One of the things you learn in philosophy is how to isolate very specific aspects of a larger question and look at them in detail. It's a little bit like what they call isolating the variable in science. So suppose someone comes along and says, hey, we want to give you a grant to talk about the factors that make water boil. And the person thinks it says, okay, let me think about it. And they come back to the people proposing the grant and say, okay, I want to do some experiments to find out whether or not the amount of potassium content in water right, has an effect on whether or not the rate at which changes in altitude affect how it boils. And the person says, well, no, I didn't. I mean, that's a tiny little issue. I want you to talk about when water boils and why. The person's going to say, well, that's an extremely complicated issue, and it's not easily solved with a scientific experiment. Yes, we want to eventually get to that, but to get to that, we've got to focus our experiments into very specific questions. And part of the art of learning to do science is learning how to do that. It's the same thing in philosophy, right? We want to talk about the ethics of preferential hiring as this huge social issue, right? Well, we can do that, but if we just talk about that generally, we're going to be talking past each other a lot, right? So instead, what I do for you is narrow the focus into one aspect of it, right? And of course, I choose an aspect that I think is going to be particularly helpful, right, for people to develop their ideas, right, and explain their reasons for their opinions on a number of other issues. Now, this is particularly important when it comes to the tests. Because when it gets to the test, I will often give you a question that really focuses things in. And if I asked you to talk about one aspect of the issue that I brought up, and you give me an essay that's a very, very insightful essay on a different topic, right, I'm going to grade you down for it. When you give a very insightful argument on something other than the question being asked, that's what I call being a presidential candidate. So if you ever watch the presidential debates, someone will say something like, what do you think about whether or not we should increase the capital gains rate, right, and lower the interest rate, the rate on dividends? Right? Well, the candidate doesn't answer the question. The candidate says, I heard the word taxes. Here's my pre-prepared speech on taxes. Well, that doesn't get us anywhere, right? And we end up with, calling the presidential debate sometimes is really kind of a misnomer, right? It's really an occasion for a series of speeches, right? I think you all are capable of doing better than that. Right? And one of the things that this class is going to do is help you to practice your skills at listening carefully to what the question is and answering the question asked, not, as Mark Twain would say, its second cousin. Right? So for that reason, right, be very careful on the discussion boards and especially on the essay portions of the test, right, to answer the specific question being asked, right, not some other question that is loosely related to it. And of course, I give you a number of different questions, so you should have a lot of field for finding some place to make the point where you want to make it. So that's what I have to say about week 1. I was happy with the discussion boards. Thank you for all your participation, and I'm looking forward to discussing act utilitarianism with you and the questions about the morality of torture in the coming week.